My name is Jake Morrison, and I'm a former construction worker who was contracted to do renovation work at a remote military installation in northern Alaska. What my team and I discovered beneath that base still haunts my nightmares 3 years later, and I'm sharing this story because the world needs to know what's hidden in the frozen wasteland. This is the terrifying truth about what lies beneath the permafrost and why the government has been covering it up for decades. It was March 2023, and our construction company had been hired to update the heating systems in the underground levels of what we were told was a decommissioned Cold War-era research facility. The base sat about 200 miles north of Fairbanks, in one of the most isolated and inhospitable regions of Alaska, accessible only by helicopter or snowmobile during the harsh Arctic winter. We were a team of 6 experienced workers, all with military clearances and years of experience working on classified government projects. And we thought this would be a straightforward job that would pay extremely well for 3 weeks of work in brutal conditions. The base itself looked typical of 1960s military architecture. Squat concrete blocks designed to withstand nuclear attacks, small reinforced windows, everything built for function over form and survival over comfort. Most of the above-ground structures were empty, with only a skeleton crew of maintenance personnel and security guards keeping the lights on and the generators running. The place had an eerie, abandoned feel that reminded me of those post-apocalyptic movies where civilization has collapsed and only ghosts remain. We were told that the underground levels were used primarily for storage and that our job was to replace the old boiler system with modern heating units that could handle the extreme Arctic temperatures more efficiently. The military liaison, a stern-faced officer named Major Collins, emphasized that we were to work only in the designated areas and that any deviation from our assigned tasks would result in immediate termination of our contracts and possible legal action. On our 3rd day, while excavating a section of the basement to install new ductwork, my partner Rick's sledgehammer broke through what we thought was just another concrete wall that had been installed to partition the basement storage area. Instead, we discovered that we had punched a hole into something much older, much stranger, and far more disturbing than any military construction project from the Cold War era. Behind that wall was a tunnel, not a modern corridor with electric lighting and proper ventilation, but something that looked ancient, primitive, and utterly alien. It had been carved directly into the permafrost with tools that left strange, curved marks in the ice. Marks that looked almost like claw scratches from some enormous creature. The tunnel was perfectly circular, about 8 feet in diameter, and disappeared into absolute darkness in both directions. The craftsmanship was impossible to explain. Perfectly smooth walls that curved with mathematical precision, but created with techniques that seemed to predate any known human civilization. The walls were covered in a thin layer of ice that had formed over what appeared to be symbols or writing that none of us recognized. These weren't scratches or random marks, they were clearly intentional, arranged in patterns that suggested language or meaning, but unlike any alphabet or hieroglyphic system any of us had ever seen. The symbols seemed to follow the curve of the tunnel, spiraling downward in both directions, like some kind of ancient roadmap to hell. The temperature in the tunnel was at least 20 degrees colder than the basement, which should have been impossible given the heating systems running throughout the base. Our breath created massive clouds of vapor that seemed to hang in the air longer than they should have, and there was a strange quality to the air itself, thicker, harder to breathe, as if it contained less oxygen than normal atmosphere. But most disturbing of all was the smell coming from deep within the tunnel. Not the clean, crisp smell of ice and snow that you'd expect, but something organic and rotten, like meat that had been left to decay in a freezer for months, mixed with an acrid chemical odor that burned our nostrils and made our eyes water.
If these stories sent chills down your spine, don't vanish into the darkness without hitting that like button. Share your scariest experience in the comments below, because your story might be featured next. And remember, the scariest thing is missing out, so subscribe now before the next nightmare finds you.
Against every instinct, every military order, and every shred of common sense we possessed, Rick, Danny, and I decided to explore the tunnel that night after the base had settled into its usual quiet routine. The discovery had been eating at us all day. The way Major Collins had reacted when we reported it, the speed with which additional security personnel had arrived, and the way they had immediately sealed off our work area and declared it off-limits. Something was being hidden from us, and we needed to know what it was before we could sleep peacefully again. We waited until after midnight, when the skeleton crew would be focused on their routine security rounds and the bitter Arctic cold would keep anyone from wandering around outside unnecessarily. The temperature had dropped to minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind was howling across the barren landscape like the screams of the damned. Armed with high-powered military-grade flashlights, climbing rope, basic spelunking gear, and a digital camera to document whatever we might find, we made our way back to the basement through a service entrance that Danny had noticed during our initial survey of the building. The hole we had created in the concrete wall looked even more ominous in the darkness, like the mouth of some primordial cave system opening into an underworld that had been sealed away for good reason. The strange symbols carved into the ice-covered walls seemed to shift and dance in our flashlight beams, creating optical illusions that made us feel dizzy and disoriented. It was as if the symbols were alive, responding to our presence and our artificial light in ways that defied explanation. The smell was much stronger now in the confined space, that awful combination of organic decay and something else we couldn't identify, something that reminded me of the way the air smells right before a violent electrical storm, charged with energy and danger. The air itself seemed to vibrate with a low-frequency hum that we could feel in our bones rather than hear with our ears. We decided to explore the tunnel heading north first, since that direction seemed to slope slightly downward and our powerful lights penetrated a bit further into the oppressive darkness. The tunnel was perfectly smooth, as if it had been carved by some kind of advanced boring machine, but the tool marks on the walls suggested something far more primitive and disturbing. The scratches and gouges looked organic, almost biological, as if the tunnel had been clawed out by massive hands or talons rather than carved with conventional tools. Every 50 feet or so, there were alcoves carved into the walls with the same impossible precision, each one containing what appeared to be offerings, artifacts, or ritual objects. These alcoves were our first real sign that whatever had created this tunnel system was not only intelligent, but had some kind of religious or ceremonial purpose in mind. The objects we found defied easy categorization. Carved figures that looked almost human, but wrong in subtle ways that made our skin crawl. Metallic objects that seemed to be made from materials that didn't exist in nature, and what appeared to be preserved organic specimens that might once have been alive. The carved figures were particularly disturbing. They depicted humanoid forms, but the proportions were all wrong. Arms too long, fingers with too many joints, facial features that seemed to shift depending on the angle of our flashlights. Some of the figures appeared to be wearing clothing or ceremonial robes, while others seemed to be depicted in states of transformation, as if they were changing from human into something else entirely. As we ventured deeper into the tunnel, our flashlight beams began to reveal something that made us question everything we thought we knew about the history of Alaska, the age of human civilization, and what might still be living beneath the permafrost. The tunnel wasn't empty. There were signs of recent habitation, and something was definitely still down there with us, watching us from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself.
If these stories sent chills down your spine, don't vanish into the darkness without hitting that like button. Share your scariest experience in the comments below, because your story might be featured next. And remember, the scariest thing is missing out. So subscribe now before the next nightmare finds you.
After walking through the tunnel for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, our flashlights finally illuminated something that stopped us dead in our tracks. A massive underground chamber that defied every law of physics and archaeology we thought we understood. The tunnel opened up into a circular room that had to be at least 100 feet in diameter and 50 feet high, carved out of solid ice and rock with the same impossible precision we had seen in the tunnel itself. But this wasn't just an empty cavern. The chamber was filled with structures, artifacts, and evidence of a civilization that should not have existed in this remote corner of Alaska, especially not buried under what had to be thousands of years of accumulated ice and permafrost. The walls were covered from floor to ceiling with intricate carvings that told some kind of story, a narrative that became more disturbing the more we examined it with our flashlights. The carvings depicted scenes of what appeared to be human figures worshiping or serving much larger, more imposing beings that looked only vaguely humanoid. These larger figures had elongated limbs, faces that were hidden behind masks or hoods, and seemed to be emerging from or returning to what looked like portals or gateways carved into the ice itself. The human figures in the carvings appeared to be offering sacrifices, objects, food, and in some of the more disturbing panels, what looked like other human beings. In the center of the chamber stood a raised platform made from blocks of perfectly cut black stone that seemed to absorb our flashlight beams rather than reflect them. On top of this platform was an altar of some kind, surrounded by channels carved into the stone that were stained with what looked suspiciously like dried blood. The stains were old, but not ancient. Some of them looked like they could have been made within the past few decades rather than centuries ago. But the most terrifying discovery was what we found arranged around the altar in concentric circles. Dozens of objects that we initially thought were more carved figures or religious artifacts revealed themselves to be something far more sinister when we got close enough to examine them properly. They were mummies, perfectly preserved human bodies that had been arranged in positions of worship or supplication, all facing toward the central altar. These weren't ancient mummies from some lost civilization. The clothing, the dental work visible in their preserved faces, the modern materials found with some of the bodies, everything suggested that these people had died within the past 50 to 70 years. Some of them were wearing military uniforms that looked like they could have been from World War II or the early Cold War period. Others were dressed in civilian clothes from various decades, as if people had been brought to this chamber regularly over a long period of time. The preservation was impossible to explain given the environmental conditions. The bodies showed no signs of decay, decomposition, or damage from ice formation. They looked like they had simply been frozen in time at the moment of death, their faces locked in expressions of either terror or strange, peaceful acceptance. Danny was the first to notice that some of the bodies were arranged in patterns that matched the astronomical alignments carved into the chamber walls. Rick discovered that several of the military personnel were wearing name tags and rank insignia that we could still read clearly. Servicemen who had been reported missing from various Arctic installations over the past several decades, their disappearances explained away as accidents or desertions. But the most chilling discovery came when I examined the altar more closely and found evidence that it had been used recently. The bloodstains weren't all old and dried. Some were fresh enough that they were still slightly tacky to the touch. Someone or something had been conducting rituals in this chamber within the past few weeks, possibly even within the past few days.
We were not alone in this underground complex, and whatever was sharing this space with us had been busy preparing for something that required human sacrifice.
If these stories sent chills down your spine, don't vanish into the darkness without hitting that like button. Share your scariest experience in the comments below, because your story might be featured next. And remember, the scariest thing is missing out. So subscribe now, before the next nightmare finds you.
As we stood in that horrific chamber, trying to process the evidence of decades of ritualistic murder and human sacrifice, we began to hear sounds coming from the deeper tunnels that branched off from the main room. Sounds that made our blood freeze and our primitive survival instincts scream at us to run. It started as a low humming or chanting that seemed to come from multiple directions at once, echoing through the ice tunnels in a way that made it impossible to determine the source or distance. The chanting wasn't in any language we recognized, but there was a rhythm and cadence to it that suggested meaning and purpose. It rose and fell in waves, sometimes becoming so loud that it seemed to vibrate through the stone platform beneath our feet, other times dropping to barely audible whispers that made us strain to hear. But underlying the chanting was another sound that filled us with primal terror, the unmistakable sound of something large moving through the tunnels, getting closer with each passing minute. Danny wanted to leave immediately, and in retrospect, we should have listened to him. But Rick and I were transfixed by what we were discovering, driven by a combination of scientific curiosity and morbid fascination that overrode our common sense. We decided to investigate one of the smaller tunnels that led deeper into the underground complex, following the sounds to their source, despite every instinct telling us to flee. The tunnel we chose sloped steeply downward and was noticeably warmer than the areas we had explored so far. The ice on the walls was melting, creating rivulets of water that reflected our flashlight beams and cast dancing shadows that played tricks on our eyes. The air became thicker and more humid, carrying with it smells that were both organic and chemical, like a combination of rotting vegetation and industrial solvents. After descending for what felt like several hundred feet, the tunnel opened into another chamber, smaller than the first, but infinitely more disturbing. This room was clearly being used as living quarters by something that was definitely not human. The walls were lined with alcoves that contained what appeared to be sleeping areas, each one filled with organic material that looked like a combination of fur, feathers, and decomposing plant matter. But it was the occupant of the chamber that nearly stopped our hearts and sent us fleeing back toward the surface in absolute terror. In the center of the room, illuminated by our converging flashlight beams, was a creature that defied every law of biology and evolution we thought we understood. It stood nearly 10 feet tall when fully upright, but its posture was hunched and ape-like, with arms that hung almost to the ground and hands that ended in claws longer than kitchen knives. The creature's body was covered in matted, dark fur that seemed to move and writhe independently of the creature's movements, as if the fur itself was alive and aware. Its face was the most disturbing feature, clearly intelligent and almost human in some aspects, but with features that were wrong in every possible way. The eyes were too large and reflected our light like an animal's, but there was an unmistakable intelligence behind them, a malevolent awareness that made it clear this thing understood exactly what we were and what we represented. When our lights hit the creature, it didn't react with the fear or surprise you'd expect from a wild animal. Instead, it slowly turned to face us and opened its mouth in what might have been a smile, revealing rows of teeth that were clearly designed to tear meat from bone. When it spoke, its voice was like grinding stone mixed with human speech, forming words in perfect English that chilled us to our cores. "Welcome," it said, its voice echoing through the chamber with unnatural resonance. "We have been waiting for you to find us. The time has come for the next phase of our work, and we need fresh specimens for the altar. You have saved us the trouble of hunting tonight." That was when we ran, scrambling back through the tunnels toward the surface,
but we all knew that our discovery had doomed us, and that this thing would never let us leave Alaska alive.
If these stories sent chills down your spine, don't vanish into the darkness without hitting that like button. Share your scariest experience in the comments below, because your story might be featured next. And remember, the scariest thing is missing out. So subscribe now before the next nightmare finds you.